Thank you, everybody that's here and the people that are online watching. Who here has any experience with .NET and AWS? All right. Well, you don't need to be here then. Sorry. No, but in all honesty, we're going to talk a little bit about how you can build and run .NET apps on AWS. And I like the phrasing of choose your own adventure because there are a ton of options to be able to do things. But before we get started, I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about myself. So my name is Levin. I'm a .NET developer advocate for a company called AWS, if you've heard of them. And my job is talking to .NET developers about all sorts of different topics, and one of them being AWS and some of the different options that you have there. If you like the way that I talk, or you think that I'm funny, or you feel sorry for me, you can follow me on social media. I'm on Twitch and GitHub and Twitter. My handle is Isaac R. Levin across all of those platforms. I also host a .NET AWS Twitch stream on the AWS Twitch channel, if Twitch is your thing. I also host a podcast called Coffee and Open Source, where I talk to different people in the tech space. I've interviewed folks like Scott Hanselman, Kelsey Hightower, Liz Fong-Jones. I've been doing it for 3 years, and I've had some great conversations with some really awesome folks. So take a look at that if you're interested in kind of long-form interview with people about tech, talking about all sorts of things, not just .NET. So with that, these are some of the questions that I typically get asked, and we're friends here. So I think that let's just I'll ask some questions and you can answer me or raise your hand, right? So these are what .NET developers ask me about AWS specifically. So first question being, does AWS support .NET? Raise your hand if you think that's true. All right, so everybody but 2 people. That's good. That's good. Next question, does AWS provide tools for .NET developers? Raise your hand if you think that is true. All right. We're getting good. People are raising their hand. People are following along. And they're like, I didn't sign up to raise my hand, but I guess it's the price you pay for free pizza. How can I host .NET apps on AWS? So do you think you can host .NET applications on AWS? Share. How can I containerize my .NET apps? Did you know that you can run .NET apps in containers? Do you know what a container is? Right? So the ability to run either Windows or Linux containers is something that you can do with AWS. Another question that people ask me all the time, and this is one of the ones I feel most passionate about, the idea of how can I move from .NET Framework to modern .NET? So obviously, we're not going to talk a lot about that, but that's something in of itself. That's a large journey that can take a long time depending on what you're doing. And there are some tools that I can show you to kind of help maybe make your life a little bit easier. And then finally, how can I break up my .NET monolith? If you've been writing .NET apps for, I think .NET's been around for 22 years now, maybe 23 years, the idea that microservices was something that didn't really exist in, I guess, typical development, right? We would have an ASPX file if you were a .NET developer from back then, a web forms, and there'd be 5,000 lines of code in one code behind, right? That's not how microservices are built. Those are monoliths. So how can you take that code base and make it a bit more modular? But there's only one thing that I want you to take away from this particular presentation, and that's AWS loves .NET, right? That's it. At the end of the day, I hope that you can feel that AWS cares so much about .NET that they'll pay for me to come out here and talk to you about it, right? All right, so let's talk a little bit about that first question. So does AWS support .NET? And I want to show you a graph, right? And so the graph starts at, nope, that's not going to work on that screen, 2008, all the way up to today. And I'm going to start showing you different pieces of functionality, different workloads, how long AWS has been committed to .NET. So Windows Server, who here has had to do anything in Windows Server, right? So Windows Server 2003 was launched on AWS in 2008, 15 years ago. We were the first cloud to be able to run Windows as a VM. All the way to today with Windows Server 2019 and all sorts of different features that are added to it. SQL Server, supporting SQL Server before than every other cloud. Yes, sir.
Oh, sorry, I thought you were asking people to.
Oh, you're raising your hand. He's raising his hand. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So SQL Server still, right? We're building this long history of support for Microsoft workloads. And when we talk about .NET, so the SDK for .NET came out in 2008. The SDK for .NET on AWS. So we have 15 years of experience supporting .NET in the cloud, longer than any other cloud provider. And going to today, we have being able to run .NET on ARM processors in the cloud, and different toolkits and different modernization tools that we'll talk about a little bit earlier to really bring value to the .NET developer. And then finally, like app modernization, like this idea that you might not want to run Windows apps, .NET apps on Windows forever. So getting your .NET apps that are running on Windows to Linux and modernize them in a really effective way. And I mean, at the end of the day, there's a lot of stuff on this screen, so I'm not expecting you to remember any of it. But at the end of the day, it's important to call out that there is a long documented history of showing how much AWS is committed to .NET and Windows workloads. The next question that I'd love to talk about a little bit is, does AWS provide tools for .NET developers? Well, most of you raised your hand, and the ones that you didn't, this slide shows that you were incorrect, right? We obviously have some tools, depending on what you're trying to do. So who here writes .NET apps without an IDE? Even the folks online, do you use Vim or Emacs, or you hate your life and you use Notepad? No one does that, right? No, no one does that. You use an IDE. You use Visual Studio, JetBrains Writer, VS Code. And the experience of being able to do these things with AWS and .NET is because we have extensions that you can get for free from the different extension marketplaces, plugins and JetBrains Writer, that allow you to manage AWS resources as well as deploy .NET apps to these AWS resources. We also have programmable SDKs, and what we also like to call is the CDK, which is a cloud development kit. So CDK is programmatically defining your infrastructure. So for instance, if you're familiar with Pulumi or you've heard of Pulumi before, similar concept, right? So I want to define my infrastructure with C#, to be able to do that, and that's called the AWS CDK, and that exists for .NET. And then if you love the command line, like I do, I love the command line. Go ahead and take a seat. If you love the command line, we have a plethora of options to be able to run different commands and build different experiences using the CLI. So we have the AWS tools for PowerShell. We have the AWS CLI, which is that's a bash style CLI. And then we have a set of .NET global tools that we've created to really enhance the .NET developer experience in the command line. And then finally, we have SAM, which is the serverless application model. And that basically allows you to, via the CLI, create serverless applications that you can deploy to AWS in a pretty effective way. If you use CI/CD today, like if you're using Azure DevOps or GitHub Actions, you have the ability to integrate those services into with AWS. We also have our own CI/CD DevOps platform called Code Catalyst, which came out in November. And it's about really enhancing that experience because we don't want to be deploying directly from Visual Studio, right? At the end of the day, we want to have some continuous, effective, and I guess controlled way to send our apps up to the cloud. And then finally, everything on the right-hand side are tools. I'm going to talk about these tools a little bit more later on in this discussion. But these are tools that you can use today for free to get from .NET Framework or some version of .NET Framework on Windows to a more modern version of .NET. And we'll talk about those like I mentioned, but there's a lot of tools here, right? So I think, does AWS, do we develop tools that help out .NET developers? Maybe. I have to see these tools first, Isaac. I don't believe you at all. All right, so how can I host my .NET application with AWS? So I think the number one thing that I want to take away from this is, depending on what you're trying to do, you have a ton of options. So I'm going to show you a flow chart. And we're going to walk through this flow chart. I apologize, it's not the most beautiful flow chart, but at the end of the day, hopefully it's pretty clear and concise. So the first question becomes, do you want to target a VM? And this is for instance, if you're using .NET Framework. Do you want to target a VM? Or do you want to containerize or maybe create a serverless application? Let's just say I want to target a VM. Do you want that VM to be managed by yourself? So you want to manage it, self-manage it yourself, or do you want it to be managed by AWS? Well, Isaac, I want to manage it myself. And if you want to go down that path, the option for you is Amazon EC2, which stands for Elastic Cloud Compute. And what is Amazon EC2? So think of it like this. It is a VM, a self-managed VM, so you control everything. You control Windows updates, you control security patches, you control group policies, you control all those things, and it's in the cloud. So similar to VMs on other providers, as well as VMs that you would have in your own environments. What's really, really important to call out is that depending on what kind of categories of functionality that you need, we have particular capabilities for EC2. So you can define what processors you want, whether it's Intel, AMD, ARM. You can control how many processors you want and what the speed of those processors are. You can also control your memory footprint or the networking speed, so being able to configure that. You also have the ability to configure the size of the VM. And at the end of the day, you add all those things together along with some additional options with Amazon EBS or Elastic Inference, which allows you to get more capabilities around security. You get 400 different individual instance types. So what that means is that you have 400 unique combinations of VMs, which is pretty valuable, right? Because depending on what you're trying to do, like, hey, maybe I need this type of VM, maybe I need this size VM, so on and so forth. But I think one of the most interesting VM options that you have is Graviton. So Graviton is an ARM-based processor. So being able to create a VM that runs an ARM processor. And it's the best price performance that you can get in EC2. So depending on what you're trying to build or what you care about as it pertains to capability, you have different levels of performance. So for instance, if you need to be able to compute some cryptographic workload or you need to do really high precision math, you have different, levels of performance increases over a typical x64 architecture. So these are some of the things to consider. And I want to show you a really silly demo about taking a .NET app and running it on EC2. So let's actually do that. So come back, please. Uh-oh. Let me see if I can fix this.
Did you maybe only share the application inside the screen?
No, I mean, it's just plugged in HDMI, so I wonder if it's... Let's extend. Come back, please. Eric left and it's all not working anymore. Oh no. This is interesting. Okay, let's duplicate. Did I? Oh, okay, all right. Hopefully the people that were online are like, oh, I'm not watching this anymore, this is terrible. So I'm gonna open up the AWS console. Please sign in again. All right, well, let me do that. Thanks for letting me know. Okay, so this is gonna take a second. Yeah, I know my password is probably not safe. Thanks, Windows. What was that? All right. And then I gotta get an MFA code. This is really thrilling stuff, I know. But it's good to be secure.
AWS has the security features.
Oh no, my password's wrong. All right. What can my password be? This is why Eric should never leave when I'm trying to do something. Broke everything. No.
No internet or?
No, I fixed everything. It's fine. I'm just trying to remember what my password is. I'm just gonna hop over to a different demo if this doesn't work, but I don't know why it's not taking my password. Cool. Can I get a clap for being able to log in? All right. All right, so this is the AWS console. So if you haven't seen this before, this is the web interface to interact with the different AWS services. So right now I am running in the Europe Central region, Central 1, which is based out of Frankfurt. So just to give you an idea, we have a lot of options as it pertains to different regions that we run in. Specifically in Europe, we have Frankfurt, Ireland, London, Paris, and Stockholm, which is fairly new. Stockholm is. So I'm going to go into EC2, and I created earlier, actually yesterday evening, I created a Graviton instance. So I created an ARM-based VM that I installed .NET 6 on. So what I want to be able to do is I want to connect to that VM. So when I created this VM, I had the ability to generate an SSH token as a PEM file. And now if I go into the command line, I'll just copy that command out. And if you look here, like I have, nope, you know what I'm trying to do. Goodness gracious. I have a PEM file. So I can actually paste that in, and it will run, it'll actually SSH into this particular VM. So I can do like uname-a, and as you can see here, I have an AArch64 processor, which means that it's an Ubuntu 22.4, and it runs Linux. So I can do like .NET Info, for instance. And as you can see, I have like the .NET 6, the .NET 6 SDK on here. So this particular project, I have an API project that I created here. It's just a simple .NET New Web API, so nothing really exciting. But I want to be able to do is I want to take this app and I want to run it on my EC2 instance, and I want to expose it over the internet. So how I can do that is I can just do .NET Run, and then specify URLs, and then I'm going to specify what I want my URL endpoints to be. So in this case, I want 5,000. I need to put a colon in there. And then HTTPS :5001. So if I didn't mess up that command, what this will do is this will actually run my .NET application. So I have a .NET application running on these particular ports now, but I want to be able to make them accessible via the internet. So how I would do that is I can go down into the security tab of the AWS console, and I can look at my inbound rules. So as you can see here, I have a few rules. I have 80, and I have 2022 for SSH, and 443, and then I have 5,000 and 5001. But I have an IP address from when I was in Utrecht earlier today, so I probably need to change that. So I'm going to go down here into my security group, and I'm going to edit my inbound rules. And then I'm going to take a look at this particular custom TCP rule that I created. I'm going to delete that, and I'm going to specify my IP address. So don't steal my IP address. That's my IP address right now. So I click Save Rules now. And now, if I hop back into where I was and go into this and look at the public DNS that I have for this particular endpoint, I can actually open that up. This is going to fail because I need to provide, it's an API. So that means that if I go to weather forecast, which is how we, maybe not, let's try the IP address. Oh, that's why. I need to specify the port. So 5001. Right, so this is a .NET Web API, .NET 6 Web API, that is accessible via the internet, that's running on an ARM processor in AWS. So I know that this isn't the most exciting demo that you've ever seen, but it shows you like in a very small amount of time, you can go from not in the cloud to running an ARM processor in AWS, latest version of .NET. So that's kind of exciting. So let's hop back into our slides, and hopefully it won't break like it did the second Eric left. All right, so that is hosting .NET apps on Amazon EC2. So let's go back to our flowchart. So we looked at the most, I guess, the most involved option. So what if I still want a VM, but I want AWS to manage that VM? So in that case, I have what's called as Elastic Beanstalk. And what Elastic Beanstalk is take into account this particular requirement. So in the previous example where I showed building a .NET app and running it on EC2, there's a lot of things that I just glossed over, right? What happens if that is a mission critical application and I need to have like multiple EC2 instances that represent that application, right? What if I need to load balance? What if I need to worry about scale? What if I need to worry about routing? I need to build all those services and create all those services and manage them myself. But if I use AWS Elastic Beanstalk, it's fully managed, which means that Route 53, which is basically Amazon's DNS, that's configured for me. Also have load balancing configured for me, and I also have auto scaling and availability zones set up for me. So I don't have to worry about all of the integral pieces like I did in the previous example. It's all built in for me. So the ability to manage scale using scaling groups is also there. And it's provisioned automatically, which means that whenever I upload a new version of my code, it does everything again for me and reconfigures it. So it's really about saving time. But you're still using the VMs, you still have the control over the VMs that you want. You just get all this additional plumbing for free, which is exciting. All right, so that is rehosting, right? Like not super exciting, but if you have a .NET Framework app or a .NET regular app today, and you want to just get it into the cloud, those are some options for you that might be interesting. So let's get a little bit more down the path of more modern as well as a bit more interesting. So instead of being a VM, what if I want my app to be a container or I want to run in a serverless environment? Well, the first question that you ask is it a .NET Framework app or is it a modern .NET app? If it's a container, you're going down the path of choosing containers, we need to be able to effectively store the definition of those containers, those container images somewhere. And how you do that is, one option is you can use Amazopn ECR, which stands for Elastic Container Registry. And what it is a fully managed container artifact registry that exists inside of the AWS system. So think about if you're building apps that run in containers, you could use Docker, for instance, but maybe you don't want to use an external image repository or image registry to manage your business critical applications. You want to have it all in one place. So you could, for instance, if you're using some of these different container services that are right there, and we'll talk about those in a little bit, you can set up Amazopn ECR to have a fully managed experience that is secure, is constantly has built-in security scanning and vulnerability scanning, and you can configure the access almost immediately. Thank you. But at the end of the day, it's really, really important to call out that you have this option. You can still use Docker if you want. You can also set up imaging. So pushing from a private Docker registry to this if you'd like as well. So that's really, really interesting and exciting to talk about. So the question then becomes, OK, so you're using .NET Framework or .NET. Pause for effect. So if I'm still using a .NET Framework application today, the question then becomes, OK, so you're containerizing it, but it's still .NET Framework, so that means that it has to be Windows containers, right? So, but do you want those containers to be serverless? So think about that for a second. I can have Windows containers that have .NET Framework applications that are serverless. That seems absolutely insane to me, but it's a capability that we have. But I don't want that because that sounds way too complicated. OK, well, instead, do you want to use Kubernetes? Because that's way less complicated, right? No, maybe I don't want Kubernetes. In that particular case, I can use Amazopn ECS, Hosted Managed Windows Containers. And what Amazopn ECS is it's a simple way to run containers in AWS. So here is a typical approach here. So at the top level, code pipeline, think of that as like CI/CD. And ALB is like a load balancer. So think about it like that. So for instance, I have still, at the end of the day, when I use ECS or Elastic Container Service, it's still managing EC2 instances under the hood. So the VMs we talked about earlier. So you still have to configure and manage those. But one of the things that you get for free is you get built-in CloudWatch, which is AWS's monitoring utility. So the ability to have that built in a container environment is really, really valuable. But maybe I don't want to use Amazopn ECS. Maybe I am orchestrating using Kubernetes. Well, in that particular case, we have Amazopn EKS, which is Elastic Kubernetes Service, and that's hosting Windows containerized images, or containerized, containers. So in that particular case, like everybody here has heard of Kubernetes, right? To an extent, like I'm not expecting everybody to know Kubernetes because I don't think anybody knows Kubernetes. But at the end of the day, like, why would you choose ECS over EKS, right? So we talked about ECS, and we was like, OK, these are some of the things you need to manage. You still need to manage load balancing. You still need to manage service discovery, secrets management, all these sort of things. Those are things that come out of the box with Kubernetes. So if you already are building apps that have a Kubernetes style, or you have those particular needs, you can have a managed version of Kubernetes running in AWS. And if you have an on-prem version of Kubernetes, you can easily map that directly to EKS and party like that as well. All right, so we've talked about, I guess the more bare minimum approach of Windows containers. And we talked about the Kubernetes a bit more involved. But like there's still something that's a bit sticky here. Like I have to manage a lot with EKS or ECS. Like I gotta manage the underlying infrastructure to an extent. I have to manage the containers. What if I don't wanna do that? Well, in that case, I can use AWS Fargate, which is a serverless offering which is fully managed containerization service. And what exactly is Fargate? So Fargate, it's still the same underlying primitives as ECS or EKS, but there's one specific difference. Every single VM, every single EC2 instance has a runtime on top of it that manages the containers and the underlying infrastructure for you, which allows you to do things like scale to 0. So imagine a world where you know your app's not going to get hit ever. You don't need to pay for it. So you can scale it down to 0, and then when you know there's going to be demand on your app, you can scale it up, right? So to be able to run containers in a serverless way is very, very interesting. And I think the biggest thing to call out that's important is that you still have the ability to configure, like the CPU, the processor, the CPU, the operating system, all those things. You can still define those, but you don't need to manage the scaling or manage any of the other things, which is valuable, at least in my particular opinion. All right, so we're about like halfway done on this slide, right? So things are gonna get complicated really fast, so I apologize. All right, so I'm going from, this is everything from here that's like boring old .NET, right? Now let's talk about new, exciting, sexy .NET. So what is new, exciting, sexy .NET? Well, is it running Linux or Windows? Because you can still write like .NET modern apps in Windows if you want. Okay, I'm still gonna do Windows. Something happens. Okay, so it's gonna ask the same question. So you wanna do Windows, serverless containers, and that's the exact same workflow as before, right? So nothing changes for you if you wanna stay building apps on Windows. So whether it's .NET Framework or .NET. Okay, but I wanna do Linux, because Linux is way cooler. All right, so then you have a kind of a decision you need to make. Am I building containerized apps? Am I building serverless, whatever that means? Or am I building static hosts, whatever that means either? If I'm going down the path of building a containerized app, the question then becomes, so is it an AWS managed containerized application? No. Okay, so you want to manage it yourself. Do you want it to be serverless? Yes. Do you want it to be managed by Kubernetes? No or yes. So these two options are the same as these options, just on Linux instead of Windows. So depending on your use case, you might still end up at the same place, but with different little adds of flavor. Okay, well, I don't want to run serverless containers. Are you using Kubernetes? Because that's the question that you always need to ask. Are you using Kubernetes? Do you love yourself? You have the ability to choose self-managed ECS or EKS instances. And this is when things start to get exciting, at least for me. Because I've like filled all of this screen with like ECS, EKS, EC2, Elastic Beanstalk, like a lot of like stuff. But there's still like management in all of these. What if I don't want to manage anything? That's when things start to get exciting, at least for me. I want to have AWS manage my containerized web or API. And to do that, I use AWS App Runner. So think of an example here. If I'm building any app today, any of the services that I talked about a bit earlier, these are some of the things I need to worry about. I need to worry about Fargate and ECS. So I actually have to configure those services. In ECS, I just check a box for Fargate, but I still have to do it. I also need to manage load balancing. I need to configure that. I also need to configure autoscaling to some extent. I know that Fargate does some autoscaling for me, but I still need to do a little bit of additional steps there. I also need to configure how my application is built. But what if I took all of those layers and turned it into one service that was completely managed by AWS? That's what App Runner is. So App Runner is simply this. I define a service. I point it at some application. It could be a Docker image. It can be a GitHub repository. It'll just take that version of your application and containerize it and deploy it to AWS. And I want to show you like how ridiculously awesome this is. So, because at AWS, we built a deployment tool that allows you to deploy directly to AWS in particular cases like this. The screen didn't go away this time. That's really exciting. The screen went away last time when you left. So there was no signal. There was no signal forever, and I had to fix it all by myself. Aren't you proud of me, Eric?
Very proud.
Very proud.
I'm looking at the screen how you do it. My settings are still
Yeah.
there.
So this is a simple .NET application. It's a MVC application. I can open this, and as you can see here, it's .NET 7. There's nothing really exciting. There's a couple of views in here. One thing that's important to call out is that this application, at this moment, is not containerized, meaning that if I wanted to containerize it, I got to create a Docker image for it, and then I got to deploy it to some service. What, instead, I could have one command that did all that for me. That's pretty exciting. So I'm going to actually show you that we have a tool for that. So I can go .NET AWS deploy, and I click this, and it takes me through an interactive experience of taking my code, containerizing it, and deploying it to AWS. So the first thing that's going to want to do is it wants us to configure what's called a CloudFormation stack. So I glossed over this, and I'll talk a little bit about what CloudFormation is. So CloudFormation is a service in AWS that allows you to define your infrastructure. So there are other clouds that do something similar, and they have different names. But in our world, in AWS, it's called CloudFormation. And those deployment configurations are called stacks. You can use the CDK, which is the programmatic way of scripting out in C# or JavaScript or Python, and that's a wrapper, an abstraction for CloudFormation. So what this tool does is it's going to create a CloudFormation stack for us and deploy our application to AWS. So I'm just going to create a new target. And then it's going to come up with a couple of options, and let's maximize this to make sure I can see it. So there's a few options here. So option 1, ASP.NET Core App to AWS Elastic Beanstalk. It's actually detecting what kind of app I have, this command line tool is, and it's recommending different approaches. I'm going to choose option 4 because I like option 4 the most. So option 4 in this particular case is ASP.NET Core App to AWS App Runner. It's going to ask me what do you want the name of the stack to be. I'll just go with the default option. And then what it'll do is it'll actually ask me how I want to configure, from an infrastructure perspective, my service. So I can configure what port it runs under, how much CPU and memory it has. If there's any additional environment variables, I can configure those. Let's just go with the default. And then it starts to do some Docker stuff. Remember that the project that I showed you in Visual Studio Code was not Dockerized. So what happened when I ran that command? A Docker file was created for me by running that command. And people are nodding their head. That means I'm actually doing something cool. So think about that, right? Like something as valuable as taking an app that's not containerized and containerizing it with one command is very valuable. What the command line tool is now doing is it took that project, it containerized it for us based on the project configurations. It's going to push that particular image to Amazon ECR, so the Elastic Container Registry. It's going to push that image definition file up there. And that's going to create, using CloudFormation, a stack which has an AWS App Runner resource in there. And then AWS App Runner is told, this is the image file that you're going to build an application for. And this takes a little bit of time because there's a lot of steps here. So when this is all said and done, we'll have a URL endpoint that I can click on, and it's an app running in the cloud. So I'm going to go back to my presentation, wait for this to finish up what it's doing, because I don't want everybody to sit and wait for a command line to finish up. So let's keep plugging along. Nothing's frozen. That's exciting. I always get terrified switching between presenter mode and not. All right, so this whole blue box is replatform. Like replatform is way cooler than rehosting, right? Yeah? But what's the purple box? The purple box has to be really exciting because I'm saving that for last, right? So the purple box is refactor. So the question becomes, I've already decided if it was a containerized app, I already did that. Serverless. If I'm building a serverless function, I'm using AWS Lambda. Who here has heard of AWS Lambda? All right. For the folks who didn't raise their hand, who has heard of like Alexa devices or like Amazon Echo devices? Like the silly little puck things that sit at your house. So if any skill that you call behind the covers, way back, it's using Amazon Lambda or AWS Lambda. But what actually is AWS Lambda? Before I kind of go down my little thing here, does anybody know where the phrase serverless comes from? Any guesses? Is it because there's no more servers?
Don't manage it.
It's because you're not managing servers?
No, there's still a server, but
Yeah, there's still a server, right? Like the server still exists because it just doesn't run, right? So here it is. Here it is. You wait. It's really corny. Because wouldn't it be great if we could care about our applications more and the server less? Hey, right? All jokes aside, right? Like the idea of like just writing some code that does some particular thing and just disappears after it's done is really valuable, right? Like that idea, that event-driven architecture, like, because think about how we build apps today. Oh, I'm dropping I need to read on a directory, and whenever a new file gets put into that directory, I need to write rows into a database. Or someone runs a stored procedure, but I also then need to do some other things. Or if I have a queue, I need to be able to interact when things get dropped into that queue, right? Like these are how we build applications today. Sure, we have web apps and things that run on timers and things like that, but at the end of the day, most of the code that we write is dependent on some other external activity going on, right? So the ability to build applications that are built around the idea of acting on some events is very valuable. Like here's an example. So if you live in the United States, the day after Thanksgiving, it's called Black Friday. Most of you folks probably have heard of it. Basically, it's how all the retail companies, how they don't go broke over the course of a year. So if I have an e-commerce store and I'm having some sale on that particular day, I'm going to have a ton of traffic, like millions and millions of transactions in a 24-hour period. The ability to scale without me having to worry about it is very valuable to me, because the benefit of something like AWS Lambda is that the scaling comes for the ride, because the entire infrastructure, everything up into your code, is not managed by you, it's managed by AWS. So when we talk about the different levels of manageability, right? We talked about at the very bottom, the ability to control at a high level every single thing about where our app lives. That's EC2. And then we can get a little bit further with a little bit managed, but it's managed containers, and that's the EKS option. And then like, oh, I want AWS to manage my containers in a serverless way, so that's Fargate. But eventually, in some cases, you might be like, I just want to have some code that runs. And the benefit to just having code that runs is that it can be very cost effective. Like we talk to AWS customers that use Lambda, their first bill, they always come up to us and they're like, I think there's something wrong with your bill. What do you mean there's something wrong with your bill? Well, we ran 14 million transactions this month and our bill was like $4. Okay, that's how much it costs. And people get immediately excited because the idea that they're getting like optimum business value for the amount of cost that they're spending on the cloud is very valuable. Right? So that's Lambda at a really high level. And I wanted to show you a really quick demo of how you can deploy or how you can kind of build Lambdas with .NET in Visual Studio. Yes?
We had a question from
someone. A question?
A question.
There's people on the phone.
Martineo asked, is there something similar to Azure Functions for .NET that is supported on AWS, which...
I am talking about that. So the idea of the question being, is there like an Azure Functions similar service, right? So the ability to have some chunk of code that acts on a particular event that runs in the cloud. Like I feel like I've just said this, right? So yeah, the answer to your question, sir, or ma'am, or how you identify is AWS Lambda. And there are other services as well that you can add that have that similar experience. So we have something like step functions, which is similar to, more a building block approach that's serverless. You might have seen things like that in some other cloud providers. And there's a ton of other services that exist that if you was to define them to, you would probably be like, oh, that makes a lot of sense. Like here, I'll just ask. Like all the services that I just mentioned, right? You've heard of other services in other clouds that are very similar, right? Everybody's nodding their head. Because yeah, like at the end of the day, the cloud's a commodity and like nothing is special, right? Everything how it provides business value using a particular use case. And most of the use cases are pretty well defined. All right, so let's just check here to see how's this doing. Oh, it's done. All right, that's exciting. Sometimes it takes way longer. 343 seconds to be exact, that's how long it took. So at the bottom here, we have an endpoint. So I can actually click on this endpoint, and it's going to pop up in a browser. And this is AWS App Runner for that particular application that I built that's running in the cloud. And I just have like a little UI that shows me some of the infrastructure pieces for this particular application. So it's an x64 architecture CPU. There's about 2.5 gigs of memory, which is pretty on point to what I defined earlier. And I have some IP addresses, right? So at the end of the day, let's just take a step back and like what I showed, right? I had a regular ASP.NET 7 application. It wasn't containerized. I ran one command, answered some questions, and now I have a Dockerized version of that app running in AWS. And I could actually, if I had some time, I'm running out of time, I could actually configure auto-scaling for it. I could click a box and say, after 100 concurrent requests, increase my node count. And I could do something like use Hey and just throw a bunch of requests at it, and I can watch in real time the amount of instances go up and down depending on load. That comes for me for free. I don't have to do anything except check a box in the cloud, which is really, really valuable. All right, so I was going to show you Lambda. So here I am in Visual Studio, because Visual Studio is awesome, and I have a simple Lambda function. All it does is every single time somebody makes a request to it, I send a string back. It makes me lots and lots of money. My business relies on it. It's a simple demo, but I wanted to show you some of the cool things that you get when you build with Lambda with .NET in Visual Studio. So we have something called the mock Lambda test tool, which is a UI test harness for testing your serverless functions. So when I click run here, I get a UI that says, hey, do you want to send some sample requests to this particular endpoint? So I can actually have a set of example requests in particular cases, like maybe I want to configure, maybe I want to build an Alexa skill. Maybe I want to whenever a DynamoDB, which is our database, which is one of our a NoSQL database offerings, when an entity gets updated, or SNS, which is our SQS, which is our queuing service, or what have you, right? A bunch of different examples. But I can scroll down to the bottom and just execute this function. And as you can see here, it just shows me the return of that result, right? So it's a UI-based testing harness for serverless functions. So you don't need to use something like Postman or some other client tool that's built into Visual Studio Code. You can just do this right directly from Visual Studio. So that's pretty cool, right? And then when I want to actually deploy this application to AWS, I can actually just use the AWS Toolkit for .NET for Visual Studio and right-click Publish on the project, because that's what everybody does. And I can go Publish to AWS Lambda, and then it walks me through the process of actually deploying this function directly to AWS. And then click Upload here. And what this is going to do is it's going to build, it's going to publish, it's going to zip up our solution, and then it's going to upload them to Amazon S3, which is our blob storage service in AWS. And then it configures Lambda to extract those files and put those files into a Lambda endpoint to be able to interface with. And once that's done, I can do the same thing that I did earlier. I can run a sample input, and then I have a response, AWS loves .NET. And this is all inside of Visual Studio, right? So this is a free tool that you get to be able to do those cool things. So, I mean, I've shown you 3 silly demos, but each silly demo does something that's kind of interesting, right? I was joking with some folks earlier, I've not wrote real code in 5 years. All I've done is silly demos like this, right? But at the end of the day, I'm just trying to show how simplistic it can be to do particular things. Oh no, oh no. All right, we're good. I'm gonna panic every single time I hit that. All right, so the last area. So we talked about containerized apps, we talked about serverless. Static hosting. Anybody know what static hosting is, or have heard of it? Yeah? So static hosting is, who here is a JavaScript developer, like Angular, Vue, React? Yeah. So the idea of building apps in those SPA type of scenarios, that is static hosting, because at the end of the day, the output of building those applications is HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So there's no server required. So in the world of AWS, we have a service called AWS Amplify. And you're probably thinking, like, Isaac, like, this is .NET. You're talking about .NET. Like, why would I ever care about static hosting? Anybody? Blazor, WebAssembly. When you build a Blazor WebAssembly application, the output of that build or that publish is HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and DLL files. So it does not need the server at all. So what about running your .NET applications without a server on AWS Amplify? AWS Amplify is very, very interesting because you can do some interesting things. Like, for instance, like if I build a Blazor WebAssembly project, when I configure AWS Amplify, you can say, okay, this is a to-do app, and this is the Dynamo database for that to-do app. It'll create a GraphQL endpoint for you without you having to configure anything. So the data storage comes along for it, the storage, API functions, geolocations comes in for free. And if you're building like mobile applications, for instance, and you need a backend, Amplify is a great option for that, right? So the full stack developer experience, and you can use Amplify to publish your React app to, your Angular app to, or your Next.js, or Strawberry Shortcake.js, or whatever, like the new JavaScript framework that comes out. Like, it's an option to be able to deploy those SPA, Jamstack sort of experiences to. And that, my friends, is the flowchart. Isn't it beautiful? Right? Yeah, clappy. Thank you for clapping. No, but at the end of the day, like I said, it was complicated, but I hope that it makes sense. So like all of the gray boxes are different options for you based on your particular use case. All right. So I'm going to wrap up talking a little bit about some of the different modernization tools that AWS has created to help make the life of a .NET developer a bit better. So the first one is app to container. So the question was, how can I containerize my .NET applications? So you can use app to container, which is a command line based utility that allows you to containerize your .NET Framework applications and containerizes them to Windows, .NET Framework applications running on Windows containers. Then you can deploy directly to AWS. So a lot of value there as it pertains to being able to get from on-prem to containerized apps in the cloud without making the commitment to go from .NET Framework to modern .NET. The next question then becomes, how can I move from .NET Framework to modern .NET? Well, we got a tool for that too. There's an open source tool called Porting Assistant for .NET, and what it does is it scans your code, it builds an assessment report of all the things that you'll need to change to go from .NET Framework to .NET Modern, and you can actually then ask it to help you port. So it'll actually update things like it'll convert your project file from .NET Framework to .NET 7 or .NET 6. Yes?
How is this, well, different is not the right question, but what kind of features does it add on top of the .NET upgrade system?
I'm glad that you asked that. I have a talk specifically about that. At the end of the day, the question was, for the folks who didn't hear it online, how is it different from the upgrade assistant? The upgrade assistant, up until probably a few months ago, was completely command line based. This is a standalone utility or a Visual Studio extension. So you can actually build like a report with graphs and charts, all based on building an assessment or building an inventory of all the things that you'll need to update. So it's in my opinion, it is a better tool to be able to show the business value of the upgrade. Because if anybody's used the upgrade assistant, it's great, but it's not geared for business folks. It's a command line based utility to help people do that. This is very much a tool that can provide value to business users as well. And it's completely free. You don't need to have an AWS account. You don't need to be an AWS customer. All the code is available for free on GitHub, and you can take a look at it. Like, if you have a .NET Framework app today, please try this. I have some talks as well that I've kind of talked on this .NET modernization story, and I do a really interesting demo of Porting Assistant. So if you're interested, follow me on Twitter and find it. Or you can message me and I'll send you one of the instances of time I've done a presentation on that. And then finally, how can I break up my .NET monolith? So again, we talked about this a bit earlier, like how we used to write apps back in the day was not the best, right? Probably not the best architecture. Now we're supposed to be on microservices because that's what people told us, right? But how do we take our existing .NET apps and make them a bit more modular? We have a tool for that too. we have Microservice Extractor for .NET, which will look at your solution and using machine learning will detect how to compartmentalize your application into different microservices and then does it for you. So it's not just like, for instance, let's say you're building like a web API and you have a bunch of controllers. It's not just going to say, okay, every controller is a different microservice. It'll actually assess the metadata for your source code, look at all the dependencies that are going on, and it'll take similar functionality and turn that into individual microservices. And again, this is something that you can get to an extent for free. I'll have a QR code which will send a link to this. And finally, what if you want to do all the things I just talked about inside of Visual Studio? So we have a tool that was actually just released called the AWS Toolkit for .NET Refactoring. So it has the functionality from app to container. It has the functionality for porting assistant. It has built into Visual Studio that allows you to do that entire story. And then the next step is test it on AWS, right inside of Visual Studio. So really, really cool stuff. And at the end of the day, let's wrap up and talk a little bit about some of the things we discussed today. So depending on where you are in your .NET journey, these are the offerings that you can run .NET apps on. If you're on .NET Framework, you have Amazon EC2, a ton of flexibility, a ton of control, managed completely by you, all the way to AWS Lambda, modern .NET, where all you care about is your code, right? But the most important thing that I want to take away is AWS loves .NET. And I hope that you take away from that it's not just me here talking about AWS because I am paid to do it, but it's because I care about .NET and I want people to have options. I don't want you to think that you can only put your code in one place. So thank you. My name is Isaac Levin. If you want to follow me more, I'm on Twitch and Twitter and GitHub. My handle there is Isaac R. Levin. This is a QR code, do a lot of interesting stuff. But if you have any questions, we can ask them here. If you have any questions on chat, I can answer them for you. And yeah, thank you so much for having me. I love Amsterdam and I love talking to you folks. So thank you so much. No questions.
The echo, I'll make the echo of it. It might not be completely correct, but any words about the state of the art in AWS for .NET ahead of time compilation and Lambda functions, recommendations or limitations?
Can you say the question again?
Any words about the state of the art? Any words about AWS?
Yeah, so I'll try to paraphrase. So the person online was asking about AOT, which is ahead of time compiling, the new feature that's available in .NET 7. It's been a part of the mono runtime for a long time, and AWS Lambda. So if you weren't aware, you can build .NET 7 AOT compiled applications today on AWS Lambda. Like you can do it from the Visual Studio extension that I showed. So that is a piece of functionality that you can do. There are some limitations and some known caveats to using ahead of time compiling. So it's very much, your mileage may vary depending on what you're trying to do, but you can do it today. It's been very, very well documented. AOT is not 100% ready yet, but in certain use cases, we had conversations with customers that they actually had a legitimate use case, so we made that functionality be available to them. Hopefully that answers their question. If not, I can maybe, if they want to follow up with me separately, we can chat more about it. Anything else? Anything from you folks? No? Was this helpful? I imagine most of you folks use Azure, right? Or on-prem, right? Did anything that I do say like, oh, like I didn't know you could do that in AWS? Was anybody surprised about what I showed?
I think the whole presentation was very complete overview of all the options they have. I think that was very relevant, interesting, and I was surprised about the static stuff.
Static hosting? Yeah. No notes? He only said nice things. That's good. That's good. It means I did a good job. But obviously, yeah, if you have any, like, as you're thinking about it, maybe you take a look at some of the resources that are in that QR code and you want to reach out, please feel free. I'm more than happy to chat with you. Get on a call with you even, if it's friendly to both of our time zones. I live 8 hours different from here. So, but at the end of the day, I appreciate your time. Thank you for putting up with me talk and make silly American jokes for the last hour or so. So thanks again.
Thank you very much for presenting.